Well, my name's Matthew Cornford, and I'm an artist, but I'm also involved in art education at the University of Brighton.
I'm John Beck, and I'm a writer and academic, and I teach at the University of Westminster in London. I've known Matthew many years, and we both at different times in our youth attended the same art school in Norfolk, and we got to know each other through mutual friends. And at various points in our careers, we've kind of gone together and worked together on different things. But we share a common interest in art and music and film. And so over the years, we've had calls to discuss the kind of connections between these things. And as time went on, we became more and more interested in art schools themselves and the history of art schools and the kind of people who went to them, and the way that art education as it was, particularly as we experienced the tail end of it, was a very distinctive kind of education that we hadn't really come across anywhere else. I'd spent at least 10 years in universities doing traditional academic subjects, whereas Matthew's background is very much a kind of art school background. He spent the equivalent amount of time in art schools. So one of the topics of conversation amongst the two of us was the distinctiveness of art education in this country particularly.
For me, to add a bit to what John said, I mean, we've known each other a really long time. And I returned to Great Yarmouth, where we both at one point studied in, I think it's around 2008, and I was aware that the building that we both spent time in studying had been closed down. But what shocked me was just the state of repair. It wasn't a ruin, but it was, the windows were all smashed. It had a big sort of kind of security fence around it. I mean, it looked pretty derelict. But the most shocking thing was that the building was actually for sale. And it just struck me as being very strange that a building that both John and I have actually got a formal qualification from was actually up for sale. And I think what started it was that we thought, well, is that just what's happened to Great Yarmouth, or is this something else going on here that across on a kind of more national scale? And as often, I think, with some of these kind of projects, this was very much for both of us to start with, really a kind of side project. I mean, I was working in a long-term collaboration. We were doing, a number of projects at that time. And I mean, this was something I would do at the odd weekend and have a look around. And it was a bit ad hoc, frankly. But over time, we started to see this was happening far wider than we'd realised. And then there was some fairly sort of obvious questions, which we didn't have the answers to, like, well, how many art schools were there? We didn't know. No one else seemed to know. So it started to be both, a sort of a genuine research project, in the sense of, well, trying to work out what had been and what was now.
Well, I suppose one of the things that struck us early on was that there were a huge number. It seemed as if there was a huge number of art schools in this country, which seems completely out of proportion to the need for art and design education. Once we started looking, the most concrete figure I think I've maybe come across is from some kind of guidebook from the mid-1960s that said that there were 157 dedicated art and design institutions in England and Wales in 1965, 157. And we thought, well, the idea that there's a dedicated big building dedicated to the teaching of art and design in Great Yarmouth, of all places, and also lots of other sort of fairly modest towns around the country, means that this is a nationwide sort of system of education, which is kind of hard to imagine in any of the arts. There isn't a kind of national dedicated system of schools and colleges of music or dance or anything else. Art and design seems to be a very particular thing. And so I guess we became more and more interested in the history of that. And the fact that there had been an extensive network of art schools that were no longer there seems to sort of, invite further investigation. And so that's what we've been doing, trying to figure out what that history was and what the story is, what the biggest story is. Part of that story, of course, is the move towards universities as the kind of default sort of higher education institution in the country, and the amalgamation of smaller colleges into bigger, more manageable units, I suppose. So from the educational point of view, that's really the story, from small colleges to polytechnics and polytechnics to universities over the post-war period. That seems to be the larger picture. But what's also happened as a consequence is that there are a large number of really quite impressive, in many cases, old art school buildings that have been sort of let go or repurposed or sometimes demolished. That sort of seem to stand as the sort of markers of a lost world in a curious sort of way. And that's how we sort of started to see this as a sort of as a kind of archaeological project to some degree, to sort of dig up and investigate the remains of this world that we've become so.
I guess the other, it started off, we were, we did a couple of talks about this, and there was quite a receptive audience. Partly because quite a few of the people in the audience had been to some of the institutions that we were talking about, so there was a kind of, that was quite a good fit, and people were interested to know what had happened, a bit like we were interested to know what happened. And after a time, it became clear that given the number of art schools, this wasn't something we could just sort of continue to just do in an ad hoc way, and we really need to think about it more strategically. And so we broke it down into regions, and two reasons for that were, one, it became more manageable. You could think about a particular region like the Northwest, and there was a kind of, it gave the research and gave actually the field work and the going out to find where these buildings were a bit more of a focus rather than just going off here, there and everywhere. But the other thing that we started to think about was how we might reach a relevant audience. And the most relevant audience, it seemed to us, to begin with, would be people who are interested in art. So we went and talked to regional art galleries. And as it turned out, a gallery in Liverpool, the Blue Coat, and the curator there, Brian Biggs, who I worked with previously, had bought a copy of a book that we'd done on this, a small copy of this book. And Brian got very excited, and we were excited about the idea of doing it looking at it as a show. But that was attractive, but it also, I think we then had to step back a little bit and think, really, well, what sort of pictures are we making here? What kind of, because there are expectations for the gallery going public. And so we started to think about how this would be accessible, but also how, and I think this really emerged by doing the first version of the show, and it's continued to develop, of how the work could create really a platform for a whole lot of conversations that people want to have about art education, about access to art, about communities, about regional arts funding, about what happens to students once they graduate, what happened to the old system that we had and what have we got now. Debates that are quite live. And so it avoided the project just being a kind of wishful, nostalgic looking back. Because also what photography is good at is it's about the present. I mean, the photographs are what we have now. They're not sort of sepia-hued images of the past. They are pictures, in some cases, of car parks, of office blocks, and sometimes of derelict buildings, and sometimes of buildings which are in a very, you know, look really look better probably than when they were built. I mean, case in point, I went back to Great Yarmouth a couple of years ago, and the art school looks amazing. I mean, they've completely restored it, absolutely perfect. Tiles on the front, you know, Regional College of Art, all of it beautiful, but it's flats. You can't study art in it anymore. It's been converted into flats, which is, you know, is part of the story, really. It's part of the story of what's happened to our civic centres. Well, and John can explore that and talk about this more. But I think for us, what was really important was that it could never just be photographs. There had to be extended captions with these photographs so that they could be located. And, you know, they're not just pictures. They are that there's a sense in which they're grounded in some kind of reality. I think to start with, this was thinking through, well, what sort of photographs could they be? And in a way, I was attracted to them being very straightforward, just as straightforward as they could be. But then there was decisions like, well, are they going to have cars in? Are they going to have people in? Are they going to be, you know, snapshots? Are we going to do the whole lot from Google Earth? You know, I mean, you could actually do that now practically. But the more I explored it, and particularly when we were, you know, looking at them being works for a gallery, I wanted them to have I wanted them to be engaging enough for people to, you know, look at the buildings and to give them, maybe to some extent, give them a bit of dignity back, you know, to treat them with some reverence. And so I started to look into and explore architectural photography, you know, with shift lenses, tilt shift lenses, that kind of thing, so that you can get the perspective correct. And then I was also interested to say, well, okay, let's exclude the things that we're not really talking about. So we're not talking about cars. So let's try and do them without any cars in. And then the odd person walking by with a, you know, with a bag full of shopping, well, that doesn't really add to the image. So let's try and do that. And then it started to create this sort of strange landscape of buildings without people, buildings without cars across a whole region, and it started to add to this sense of melancholy, I suppose, the idea of an absence. And it also set up quite a lot of technical challenges, because a lot of these buildings are actually in town centres where, you know, there are quite a lot of cars and people about. So it started to be quite, interesting might not be the right word, but a challenge to say, well, how can I get this without, and so what you end up doing is having to spend quite a lot of time just waiting for the moment. And then there was, well, you want decent lighting on the side of the building, so it's bringing out some of the detail. You know, there was a whole lot of decisions that get to be made. And I didn't want to start deploying some artistic trope, really. I wanted it to be as straightforward as possible, but that's actually proved to be quite, for me anyway, quite challenging, so that they just unassuming, but you start to pick up on certain, you know, things as you run through the series, as you look at them. And they're done so they can be of a scale as well. I think that's an important aspect to it. You know, there's a sense of scale to them. And there's a kind of window in the year when I can do the work, you know, which is in the summer, where it's practical to be outside for that length of time, where the lighting is good. And I'm not engaged in my teaching commitments. But another aspect that's sort of that's come out of this is that we've started to look for clues, if you like. And one of the clues is, you know, is there a sign on the building that says art school? You know, is there a piece of, and then, you know, some of the buildings even have things like stained glass windows declaring that they are an art school. So those kind of relevant things have also started to feature now, and we've gathered those together. If you're there, you may as well. But equally, and this was really quite an important decision, I recall, I think it was Horsham School of Art I went to, and I remember calling John up and I said, well, it's gone. it's not there. It's just like this bit of wasteland. And John said, well, you'll have to photograph that then, won't you? And it's like that was for me quite profound, because it's like that's taking it beyond just being a kind of archaeological survey. It's like, well, there's a statement there when you photograph a piece of wasteland and you say what it was there. There's a sort of that sort of absence, and it's, you know, sadly it's not unique. There's others that have that absence. But that it is about visiting every single site and documenting what's there now.
Yeah, I think that was early on. That was quite an exciting prospect. Once you realised that there was a large number of sites, the first thing that came to mind was, well, we have to have a photograph of all of them, and it becomes a kind of weird procedural thing at that point where you have to follow through in this kind of somewhat anonymous fashion. You know, it becomes a sort of the task that you have to fulfill, and I think that became quite an interesting part of it.
Well, I mean, we both were interested in certain types of conceptual practice, and we both realised that this hopefully was going to get more and more interesting and rich as time went on. So when we had about 5 photos, it was like, well, you know, 5 photos. But with the whole of the Northwest, which is whatever it is, 32 photos, and then we're thinking, well, if we eventually, and I don't know how long that will take, we get to 157 photos, it starts to be, and you start to read what's happened to every single one of those institutions. This takes on a kind of different, you know, I'm quite interested in that very long-term kind of scale of project.
It's interesting formally as well, because once you've photographed all the buildings in a particular region, you start to recognise certain kind of sort of local or regional characteristics, like, you know, the kind of bricks that are used in a particular part of the country makes that part of the collection look different to another part, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is curious about this is that, I mean, there's been a couple of different waves of art school building, but a lot of the art schools were designed and built by local architects, people who were actually employed by the local authority, by local builders, and built right in the middle of the town. And we did a project where we looked at that kind of those kind of buildings in contrast with some of the what were called the millennial art gallery projects, where you had these new art galleries like the Public in Warsaw, in West Bromwich, New Art Gallery Warsaw, stuff like that. And we were looking at these kind of different contrasts of kind of civic building over different time periods in relation to art. And that was, I think that was quite revealing, that the way that these art schools were often seen as forms of civic pride. You know, that they were campaigning people were campaigning to have an art school in their town. I mean, can you imagine?
Certainly in the Northwest, they're often built at the same time as the library or the art gallery. So they're kind of markers of a particular certain aspiration or culture. It
was actually quite joined up, where you would often have the library, the art school, the art museum, you know, configured in relation to each other. There was this idea that these things were kind of interrelated. Well, the immediate future, obviously, and we're very excited about the opportunity to exhibit the work at Touchstones in Rochdale, and we're looking forward to being part of the programme of events there. And what's interesting is that this project this will be the 3rd iteration of this show in the Northwest, and I think what's great is that each one's been completely different. I mean, really different kind of focus, and what's been really, I think, new for the project at Rochdale is the way we've been able to draw on the archive, extensive archive of material held by the Art Gallery Museum, and that's really excited us to the idea that, well, there's going to be other places where that would be possible, and you know that you can make what were probably, you know, objects that may not have seen the light of day for some time, you can re-engage an audience, and there's a kind of way of reanimating those within the exhibition space and in relation to our project. So I think that's been a really significant shift from just doing the photos. The idea that we can work and collaborate on archival material. But the next region we're focused on is the West Midlands, and we're doing that mainly as we've had an invitation from the New Art Gallery in Walsall to show the outcomes of that work, which is a really appropriate venue for a number of reasons, geographical, and also because of their aspirations that they have in terms of education outreach. And what we're doing on each of these is, as is evidence with Rochdale, is we're looking for a kind of particular angle, particular thing that we'll draw on, which will be relevant to that region. So the the West Midlands will be which we've started work on. But to be honest, the plan is to cover every region in the UK, and I think there's about 5 more to do. And the one that, there's a number that are really interesting, but probably Yorkshire and Huntside is just that would be a really major area, because there was such a huge number of art schools in that region, and there's some fascinating narrative stories, etc., that we could potentially draw on, but it's dependent on our building partnerships and relationships with regional institutions, in order that, and obviously that facilitates us being able to apply for funding to continue. So there's a sort of, it's quite interconnected to the opportunities that we can foster, really. Whilst I was fortunate to, certainly in the latter part of my art education, to study at a number of London institutions, including the Royal College of Art, I was really, and I think, John and I both were really interested, not so much where people ended up, but where people started. And I think one thing this project wants to do is celebrate the beginnings of people's artistic careers, where they start in the regions. And whilst there are, a number of books about institutions like the Royal College, Black Mountain, etc., what there isn't is very much appreciation of how those institutions are always dependent on people's beginning their art and design education somewhere else, usually somewhere else that's not even very celebrated. And I think, I didn't even used to have Great Yarmouth on my CV. I just didn't used to bother with it. And I think it was that overlooking, that the fact that these places were quite often overlooked, that draws me back now to want to make them visible, or what was the history of those institutions visible. And I think, alongside providing entry to art education in a specific institution dedicated to art education, which is quite different to going to a bigger institution and studying art, they also provided employment opportunities for local artists in the regions. And they also provided employment opportunities for, visiting lecturers. So there was a kind of way in which this needs to be seen as perhaps an ecosystem, rather than a series of grand institutions. The art education in this country was almost by accident, this quite elaborate system of small regional colleges, bigger institutions, world famous institutions, but they all had a connection and interrelationship. And that ecosystem is probably what I would like, once the project is finally completed, to make really, really visible. You can actually see the whole thing mapped completely. And then there's potentially quite an interesting job of work to be done in filling in all the stories, because there are many, many stories, as we've found out in Rochdale.